My 60 Years on the Plains, Chapter 15. On September 16, we broke camp, knowing very little of our intended route and not knowing whether the Indians we might meet would be friendly or hostile, but thoroughly prepared for every emergency. We traveled over a rolling country, passing a warm spring where we saw a village. They were the Warm Spring Indians, belonging, I think, to the Dog family. They did not appear very industrious, having poor lodges, very few ponies, and nothing to trade. For several days we were busy trapping, and large quantities of beaver and otter were being caught. The country was beautiful. In every direction the scenery was grand, and the region was a hunter's paradise for all kinds of game, particularly bear. On Rush River, we found the richest place for beaver we had yet come across, and it took us 40 days to clean that section. At one of our camps, Howard made another of his characteristic remarks. Quote, "If people in the States could see this camp with the immense number of beaver stretched on hoops and hanging on every available limb, they'd go wild. When I return and tell them about it, they'll not believe me. Neither will they believe an account of the life of the trappers who appear to be perfectly at home in a country that none of them has ever heard of or seen." It was now towards the last of October, and the weather looked stormy. We moved to a valley about 10 miles from the Sierra range of mountains, and by the time we had a corral built, it was storming. By noon the next day, there was over a foot of snow on the ground. Black-tailed deer were seen in every direction, and we secured plenty of fresh meat. We held a council and decided to cross the mountains before the snow got too deep. From the summit of this range was the greatest view I ever beheld. To the westward lay a large valley, dotted with pine, alder, and cottonwood. Beyond, a large and beautiful lake sparkled in the sun as if dotted with diamonds. At this body of water, known afterwards as the Great Klamath Lake, was the scene of the Klamath and Modoc War in 1856, in which I was a participant. We moved rapidly down the valley, sending 6 men in advance to select a winter camp. They chose a spot on a beautiful stream about a half-mile from the lake. Here we built our corral in the center of a grove of pine and put up 4 lodges and 3 tents. We had an abundance of dry timber and pure water. Game and fish were on every side. Since leaving the Warm Springs on Deschutes River, we had not come in contact with Indians, but an abundance of signs indicated that they were in close proximity. On the 3rd morning, a party of 15 appeared in camp, somewhat astonished at finding so large a body of whites. They saw at a glance that we were trappers. After they dismounted, we invited them into our largest lodge and feasted and smoked. They were well versed in sign language, and Duringer could talk with them in Chinook. Lalik, their chief, asked all manner of questions. He was a medium-sized, dark complexion and with rather pleasant features. After our telling him that we intended to winter in this place, he was satisfied and assured us that we would not be molested by his people. Their village was about 10 miles distant on Upper Main Klamath River, and these Indians were on a hunt after elk, needing hides to repair their lodges. We unpacked some Indian goods and told them we would trade with them for any furs they might bring to the camp. Marten were very plentiful in this section, and these Indians were adepts in taking them. A marten hide weighs about 2 ounces and was worth in those days $6 per skin. The reason I mention this is to give some idea of the amount and value that could be packed on a horse. The average pack weighs 150 pounds, which if packed with martens would mean in value $7,200. These Indians sometimes crossed the Cascade Mountain to Willamette Valley to trade with the Hudson Bay Company. A few of the Hudson Bay trappers had passed through the country, but no such an outfit as ours. They knew that there was another class of white men called Boston men, which means Americans. The Hudson Bay men were called King George's men, and are so called today when speaking to Indians in Chinook. East of the Rocky Mountains, these Hudson Bay men were called Redcoats by the Indians. Lalek told us that there was another tribe below this lake on a smaller lake, and they were known as Cultus Siwash, bad Indians. These were the Modocs, whom we almost annihilated in 1856. We passed the winter very profitably, many of the men learning the Chinook jargon, which was easily acquired. About every tribe of Indians west of the Rocky Mountains can converse in this language. Here was the greatest contrast between two tribes living in close proximity to each other. One was exceedingly friendly and very happy to have whites in their country. The other had a hatred against both whites and Indians. Up to this time, neither tribe could have met with many whites. We asked Lalek how many warriors the Cultus Siwash could muster, and he counted on his fingers several hundred. We also found out that they had a few flintlock guns and many bows and arrows, the points of which were poisoned. Williams was always supplied with ammonia, which was considered an antidote for poison. It was used by scarifying the wound with the point of a knife and applying the ammonia, as well as freely inhaling its fumes. That winter we enjoyed ourselves as few mountain men ever had, and before leaving this camp we invited to a feast the head men of the village. Among these was the noted war chief Comtuckney, a noble-looking Indian. After the feast, we presented each one with some article given to Lalek and to Comtuckney, each a bannock pony. Highly pleased with their entertainment, they shook hands and bade us farewell and invited us to come again. Lalek advised us to keep along the base of the mountains to avoid meeting the Modocs. The advice was good, but was not heeded, as after results will show. Next morning, we packed up and reached the lower end of the lake and remained there 2 days on account of rain. Beaver were scarce, and the time was spent in reading and looking after stock. On the third day, we started for Lost River, which empties into Tule Lake in the Modoc country, and explored it to its source, traveling through a beautiful valley, but found no beaver. On our return trip down the valley, we met a party of 30 Indians who approached us at a rapid gait. They came up boldly and in an insulting manner ordered us to halt. They wanted to know what we were doing in their country. We told them our business and also produced pipes saying, "We're friends." They scornfully refused the proffered pipe, saying, "We do not smoke with white dogs." This was dangerous talk, for our men understood every word and could have made short work of them. Their demand for horses was, of course, refused, and the manner in which they left indicated that trouble was ahead. These Indians talked Chinook and were good in sign language. We traveled east about 6 miles to a patch of timber and were fortunate to find a good spring. A corral was built and rifle pits dug, the men jokingly saying, "We're going to have another bannock rupture with these devils." Just before sundown, several Indians hovered around, taking in our situation, but did not come close enough to discover the preparations made for their reception. Our war horses were placed in the center of the corral, surrounded as much as possible by the pack horses, so as to protect them from bullets and arrows. In the bannock fight, we had lost 11 pack horses. On the north side of camp were some scattering pines, and should the Indians attack us in force, this would be the danger point, although we had put up strong rifle pits. These pits are constructed in the following manner. A long hole is dug to extend completely around the camp, the dirt being thrown up on the outside. On the top of the loose dirt, we place logs making portholes under the logs. When shooting through these holes, the logs protected our heads. Our arms were, as usual, in prime condition. Rifles in those days were muzzle loaders, and so were pistols. The trappers were very expert in making cartridges for both arms and could load and shoot a rifle 4 times in a minute. I have seen some experts shoot 5 times a minute. It was a full moon, and this was greatly in our favor, as we did not know what tactics the Modocs would pursue. 15 men were put on guard at a time, but nothing occurred in the night. At daylight, we could see the Indians collecting on a high knoll about 1.5 miles distant. Their every action was watched by Williams and others with spyglasses. All stock was watered and put back in corral, and we all ate breakfast. As these Indians used poisoned arrows, the trappers prepared what they called their coat of mail, quote unquote. All the men had heavy black-tailed deer skins, which they wore over their shirts or coats, tied or buttoned up to the chin and reaching down to the thighs. Just prior to an engagement, these were all soaked in water and wrung out. It is impossible for any arrow, whether iron or flint pointed, to penetrate buckskin so prepared. I have heard many people express doubts as to this, and have always advised them to wet a piece of buckskin and try to penetrate it with a needle. By 8 o'clock, fully 200 Indians had assembled on the knoll and were holding a great council. I told Williams that I would give $100 to be there and hear their comments on the easy manner in which they were going to capture these few white dogs and all their horses. The 30 Indians whom we had met the day previous had counted our exact number and had taken note of our fine horses and the many packs. All of this would be magnified, whetting to a high degree the cupidity of the whole tribe. End of chapter 15. My 60 Years on the Plains, chapter 16. The Modocs at length mounted and in a leisurely manner approached to within 300 yards of camp and halted. 2 of their number dismounted and came towards camp holding up both hands, which was the sign for we have no arms. Williams and I met them, but we went thoroughly armed, and we noticed bows and arrows slung on their backs. They were chiefs and asked us many insulting questions, calling us dogs, demanding all our horses, all our guns, and in fact everything we had. In return for all this, they said that if we complied with their demands, they'd let us go. If we did not comply, they would rub us out, rubbing the palm of one hand over the other, signifying that they would annihilate us. Williams replied in a calm manner and told them that they could have none of our goods. If they wished to smoke and make friends, good, and we would leave their country. I think, judging by their looks, that they thought we were afraid of them, for they told us to, quote unquote, go dogs. Williams' eyes flashed fire, and I felt like making the Modocs eat their words. They stepped backwards for some distance, and we also. The Indians now held a long council, after which about half of their number dismounted. Their intention was to rush camp and take it by assault. The footmen made a detour and reached the scattering pines. The horsemen divided, and we understood we would be attacked from all sides. 15 men were detailed on the north side facing the scattered pines, with every preparation made for a hand-to-hand conflict. Each man had his toothpick or large knife in his belt besides a trapping hatchet. The latter contained 2 pounds of steel, a sharp and dangerous weapon in the hands of a determined man who was contending for his life. When the footmen reached the timber, they gave a signal for the attack, which was responded to by the horsemen, who sent forth yell after yell, thinking no doubt it would paralyze us with fear. But it had the opposite effect. On the south and west, the battle opened, and the war whoops and yells sounded to us on the north as if pandemonium had broken loose. The footmen began a charge, firing a few guns and sending a flight of arrows. We reserved our fire until they had come within 40 yards of the rifle pits. The Modocs could not see us, and having noticed that no shots came from that side, they must have thought that we were all contending against the horsemen, for they came on a run and in close body. We emptied our rifles and completely surprised them, for they halted and looked bewildered. Then the shotguns and Colts were brought into play with terrible effect, almost every shot bringing down an Indian. 17 of their bravest warriors made a charge to the east of us and almost reached the corral when 10 of our party met them at close quarters. It was a furious hand-to-hand conflict and showed the great superiority of palefaces over Indians. Pistols, knives, and hatchets did terrible work, and in less time than it takes to tell it, 15 of the Indians were dead. 2 of the attacking party making their escape. There were no casualties among the trappers except a few scratches. While the hand-to-hand fight was going on, the 5 men in the rifle pits kept the rest of the Indians at bay. The ground in front of our breastwork was literally covered with sprawling Indians, many of whom crawled to the trees and were helped away by their comrades. After this repulse, it was simply a tree fight on our side. On the south side of the camp, a hot fight was raging, and some of us rushed over just in time to assist in repelling a furious charge. 3 of our men were down and several others wounded, but the latter were not disabled. On this charge, the Modocs came up to within 50 feet of the rifle pits, but with all their bravery, they could not withstand the steady fire of the trappers, and they soon withdrew to a safe distance. Many women arrived and rendered assistance, taking the dead and wounded back to their village amid the most dismal howls that I've ever heard. At a signal from the chief, the Indians collected in a body to hold council. We had lost 3 good and brave men who had been in many a desperate engagement. These were buried while the Indians were holding council. A single Indian was soon seen approaching, and he was met by Williams and myself, and we asked him what he wanted. He said he wanted us to stop fighting and to let them take off the dead and wounded. We told him to send for the women and pack them off. He returned to the main body, and in a short time the women appeared leading ponies. They packed 2 bodies on a pony and acted as if they were frightened to death, not knowing what manner of men we were. We dragged out the 15 who had been killed in the hand-to-hand struggle, and they soon had them all packed off. Many of our men were in favor of making a charge, knowing that we could rout them with ease. Ours was certainly the first large party that they had come in contact with. They had no doubt met with smaller outfits, for we found on them several trappers' knives. At all events, they knew our exact numbers, and they made sure of having overwhelming odds in their favor, expecting to win easily. Where their calculations failed was in their ignorance of the trappers' arms. They did not know that each one was armed with 2 6-shooters and that we had 7 double-barrel shotguns besides the hot rifles. Had they known these things, I doubt very much if they would have attacked us in the manner in which they did. After collecting all their dead and wounded, the Indians withdrew. An incident occurred in this same grove during the Modoc War of 1856, which will well illustrate the difference between the whites and Indians in attack and defense. General Crosby was commander of the whites, and in his command was a company of 60 Rangers, the original California Rangers, of which I was a member. The Modocs were in possession of this grove, with the Rangers on the outside, just the reverse of our present fight. The Indians outnumbered the Rangers 2-1, but in just 1/2 hour's fighting, the Rangers routed the Indians, inflicting considerable loss, and secured possession of the grove. After the Indians had retired, we turned out our horses to graze, protected by a guard of 10 men mounted on their war horses. Some of the men climbed to the tops of high knolls so as to get the lay of the land. As yet, we had collected no furs this spring, and as there was no possibility of a trade with the Modocs, we determined to break camp the next day, Indians permitting. Our intention was to travel eastward to the base of the Sierra Nevada. During the day, we strengthened our position somewhat to prepare for another defense, as Lalek had claimed that the Modocs numbered several hundred. Stock was left out until dark, and all kept a sharp lookout. A few scattering Indians could be seen towards the lake, but none seemed inclined to make our acquaintance. The Indians must have called together all their medicine men to explain the cause of the disastrous defeat at the hands of a few white dogs. At all events, they did not bother us during the night. At daybreak, all our belongings were packed, and mounting our war horses, we started. 10 men acted as an advance guard, 10 brought up the rear, and 5 on each flank. At every point, we were prepared to repel an attack. We proceeded south for about 3 miles and struck a lodgepole trail leading from the lake, going east. We followed this trail to the foot of a bluff having a rise of some 300 feet. It was on top of this bluff that the massacre of 29 immigrants by the Modocs occurred in 1852. Only 3 men made their escape to Eureka, California, and reported the occurrence. Ben Wright, an old mountain man, collected a company of his acquaintances to avenge this slaughter of men, women, and children. He met the Modocs on Lost River at Natural Rocky Ford, about 12 miles from our battleground, and after a hand-to-hand conflict, routed the Indians with considerable loss. That was the second defeat for the Modocs. Immigrants taking the Saunders Cutoff to Northern California and Southern Oregon used to pass over this trail, but after the massacre, they traveled by other routes. The place where the massacre occurred is called today Bloody Point. End of chapter 16.